So when we discuss trauma, especially childhood abuse, we frequently bring up three main varieties: physical, sexual, and emotional. And as I've discussed in previous videos, these three types of abuse will often instill a negative belief or beliefs about oneself that themselves arise in order to defend us in social interactions. That is to say, that the lie that the trauma teaches us is that we're not worthy of love or consideration. We come to believe that lie over years, and it takes a long time to do it. But in addition to these three types of abuse, there's another type that can cause this same problem, only it can be more dangerous because it can be invisible. Hey, I'm Dr. G. I am a practicing psychiatrist and also a fantasy author. And welcome to the Imaginarium. And here we talk about mental health and story and how all of this stuff gets intertwined and interrelated. So now, the kind of abuse that causes the same kinds of toxic beliefs that the other kinds of abuse cause. But the problem with this hidden kind of trauma is that unlike physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, the kind of abuse I'm talking about exists more in the negative, in what was not done rather than what was. And yet it can be just as damaging. And in some ways it can be worse, only because it can go for years unrecognized. In dealing with trauma, excuse me, you have to first face the trauma. And I don't mean relive it with somebody else, okay? And sometimes therapy asks us to do this and go through it in minute, brutal detail. Now, I don't actually agree with that kind of therapy. I don't think it's necessary. It's very painful. It's unnecessarily toxic. In fact, you can even re-traumatize people doing that. Instead, what I mean by facing the trauma is recognizing that it happened and that it has had long-lasting effects on us, that it happened and that this kind of maltreatment can cause certain emotional patterns to develop. That's what I'm talking about. Now, in the three kinds of abuse that I've talked about so far, this can be very difficult. But part of what makes it more manageable is that it is visible. It can be recalled in distinct events that happen. I was hit. I was called these names. This kind of molestation happened, blah, blah, blah. With the hidden kind of abuse, though, that this video is about, it can go unnoticed because we rationalize it, we dismiss it, or we question it. Did it really happen? Or am I just whining? Am I just being a snowflake? Blah, blah, blah. And there's other ways in which this hidden abuse gets covered up with things like, well, other people had it worse than me, or it could have been worse. Well, at least nobody hit me or called me names or molested me, blah, blah, blah. And yet, in 20 years of clinical experience, this kind of hidden abuse that I'm talking about here can cause just as much mayhem in the psyche as the overt kinds. So, enough secrecy, what am I talking about here? So the hidden abuse that I'm talking about is neglect. Now, it's extremely important to recognize something here. In our current social media world, there's a lot of personalities and political pundits and all that who love to talk about how young people think everything is trauma, and then they start bringing in the generations and, oh yeah, Gen Z and millennials and boomers and blah, blah, blah. And then talking heads in the media will start barking on about kids these days and they can't handle stress and et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, predictably, the people that are being called snowflakes and all that started lobbing defensive insults, saying these people are insensitive assholes and they're literally Hitler and all that kind of thing. And before you know it, we've got a full-on, completely useless internet flame war, and this gets us exactly nowhere. And the reason I'm talking about that is because all of this psychobabble in the mainstream media outlets is a massive distraction. Neglect is a real thing, and it's extremely toxic. And what do I mean by neglect? Well, what I mean is that kids left on their own for long periods of time. Maybe they're not given enough food, or they're just blatantly ignored. It's when a child is confined to an area and then just left there for hours or maybe even days. I've heard stories of children who are locked in their basement for days because their parents wanted to go use drugs, or they were just upstairs getting drunk. And the kids were just not allowed to come upstairs. Leaving kids in parking lot for hours while they go off on Amway meetings or something. when children are simply ignored because their parents were drunk or high or engaging in other activities behind closed doors that they didn't want to be bothered by chattering kids. That's neglect. I'm not talking about someone who has denied their avocado toast or had their Xbox taken away for a day. And yet some internet personalities love to equate these things because it's so inflammatory. And it helps nothing. It gets clicks. That's great for them, I suppose. But it doesn't help anybody with any real issues. No. Now, there is a real issue in the center of all of that BS, and that's resilience. And we're talking about the fact that adults raised more recently, do seem to have lower resilience than previous generations. But the resilience question has nothing to do with the discussion of how harmful neglect can be. And I will discuss resilience in another video in the future. But for now, I think I just want to make sure everyone knows that it's important not to conflate these two subjects the way the internet blockheads love to do. So let's get this straight. Neglect is abuse, full stop. And it can be cruel, and that it can go unnoticed by the sufferer, especially when they are inclined to dismiss treatment that is not overtly assaultive, the way physical abuse is. But anyone knows that children crave attention, so much that they sometimes will seek out negative attention rather than being ignored. And this, like so many kinds of mental suffering, exists as a defense. And it's because being ignored in the ancestral environment would have equaled death. Human children, compared to other animals, are almost completely helpless, and this condition persists not for a few months, as you see in almost every other kind of animal, but for years. There are reasons why this is that are kind of complex, and they have to do with our evolutionary history, but for our purposes here, just suffice it to say that this prolonged vulnerability has caused several behaviors to be instilled in our species in childhood as a defense. And one of these is the constant seeking of attention from adults. Children that did this survived to become adults who then reproduced. But this means that the hunger for attention can also be starved. And for humans, this is a lot like food starvation. And in a species where getting food for oneself is delayed for many years. And of course, many children who are neglected are also starved for food as well as attention. But because nobody hit you or nobody molested you, the adult survivor of neglect may think to themselves, well, I didn't have it so bad. And then when they hear all of this cultural internet chatter and social media chatter about it, they might feel even worse. They might think, oh, well, I'm just, being a wuss and all that kind of thing. This is a lie. This kind of treatment is cruel, and it instills the same kinds of toxic beliefs that other kinds of abuse do. Only in the case of neglect, the adult will feel this sense of worthlessness and emptiness that other trauma survivors do, but they won't have any idea what's causing it because they will have dismissed it in their minds, or others will have just convinced them that they're just whining or whatever. So then what do? Well, they blame themselves. They compound this toxic belief with other ones like, oh, I'm just broken, or I'm just a mess. I'm not worth the trouble, blah, blah, blah. And that makes it worse. And of course, those beliefs are lies too. So what's the way out of this? Well, and as I like to do, the answers to this are actually very, very ancient. And I have another video that I will link to this one where I talk about the folktale Hansel and Gretel, because this is exactly what that folktale is actually talking about. Now, it's in fantastical terms, but actually just adds more to its authenticity because the symbols used in that story are actually very accurate reflections of the way the complexes evolve and emerge in a child who is neglected. So I'll leave that link in the description. You can go check that out if you want to. For our purposes here in psychotherapy, what you want to do is identify the events that cause the toxic beliefs, of course, and don't allow yourself to neglect is a bad word, but dismiss what happened. So recognizing on a deep level that those beliefs that are acquired as a result of this treatment are lies. And there's a reason why those lies emerged. It's not because you're stupid. It's not because you're an idiot or you're broken or you're a mess or any of that stuff. It's a natural human defense mechanism that emerges in childhood. And it emerges in order to protect us. Now, this might seem counterintuitive. Like, what is the point of having a belief that you're not worth anybody's time? It's risk management. That's what it is. A child, we have a lot of defenses that kick in as a result of neglect and abuse. And it's just because as a species that has so long of a time of prolonged adolescence and juvenile state, it takes us so long to get to the point where we can reproduce ourselves. There's a huge window in which things can go wrong. So there's a lot of childhood defenses that will kick in, and they will persist because they're very powerful emotional motivators. So, and this is one of them. A child who has low confidence and so low self-esteem will be less likely to ask for anything or to provoke further abuse, or worse, risk being kicked out of the social group. It's a toxic belief that keeps us from rocking the boat. And we will then, later on in adulthood, oftentimes, retroactively justify it. We will rationalize it. We'll think, well, I don't like rocking the boat. They'll internalize it. They'll think it's an essence, a part of their essence, or a part of who they really are. That belief that I'm worthless, for example. Oftentimes people see people identify with it, and they'll say, well, I'm just the kind of person who believes that they're not worthy. No, you don't have to be that way. That's a lie that abuse and neglect taught you. And you don't need to feel that way anymore. And so now it's easy for me to say that, but the process of therapy in which you arrive at that place, a lot of times takes quite a bit of work. But that's ultimately what's really happening. That's the way it plays out. Now, of course, these beliefs that emerge as a result of this maltreatment persist into adulthood when it's no longer needed. And of course, it's very painful. People will often try to soothe this pain with all kinds of addictions. They'll try to fill the emptiness with all kinds of poisons. I don't need to explain that. I mean, it's evident all over, everywhere you look. But the point is that it heals. I see it every day, and it's immensely satisfying to see it. With high quality treatment, therapy, medications, everything, you can see a recovery and a change, and you can see these changes be preserved permanently. No longer believing that you're worthless or not worthy of love or care, because you are. But it's one thing for me to say that. It's another thing to see a person and the light bulb go on and they actually believe it themselves. And they go, oh, yeah, that's right. That's what makes it all worthwhile. So check out the video on Hansel and Gretel, which I'll link down here. Also, fantasy fans, check out King of the Forgotten Darkness. The link for that will be in the description as well. That's my new fantasy novel. It's catching on. Good. I'm glad to see the numbers are doing well. So that's exciting. Anyway, that's what I got for you today, and I'll catch you next time.